Hello, Neil. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Andy. Thank you very much for having me on.
It's fantastic to have you here in a week that's been incredibly exciting for the university with the announcement of the Research Excellence Framework results. And there's lots of happy people about the university at the moment, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just gives us that boost in our research, because research projects can go on a long time.
They certainly can, and especially research projects that have impact at the heart of them, where many of those projects can have years, sometimes decades of actual impact across their community. And it's wonderful to have this chance then to talk to some of the impact case studies that we submitted in this assessment, and just to hear the diversity of ways in which people are making a difference in their community, but also internationally as well. But to kick things off, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do at the university.
So I'm Professor of Criminology and Criminal Justice in the School of Health and Society, and I'm located within the Sociology and Criminology subject group.
Okay, and so your research has been principally in the area of criminology over your career, or where did you sort of begin?
Well, that's a good question. Yeah, right at the beginning, it was looking mainly at children's experiences throughout their childhood and children's rights, and really about bringing out the voice of children. And my PhD was looking at kids' views of smacking. So that was in the 1990s, and then looking at parenting and parenting in poverty and some real pressures on parents and how they coped, and families. And around about the late 1990s, a lot of policy and practice interest in kids and families was in young offenders, as they were known then, as kids who got in trouble, and what we can do about it. And there was a big sort of concern and panic around. And I sort of my research drifted into that direction. And I started evaluating institutions, custodial institutions, where kids were locked away at that time. And that's really, since that time, the last 20-25 years or so, that's been the real sort of bedrock of my research area. But more generally, now it's how do we help and support kids and families who are, get into trouble, getting caught up in the system? How can we help them? Because they're often the most vulnerable groups in society.
And the starting point of that was their sort of realization that there was some real sort of inadequacies in the system for you that really sort of focused your attention then.
Yeah, I mean, I came into academia. It wasn't for me about writing articles that would stay in libraries forever and never get read. It was about making a difference, and growing up and I come from a working class background, and you see people in poverty really struggling, coping, and sometimes really the system doesn't help. It can work against people. So my impetus has always been about what can we do to make a difference? What can we do to change the system around that are meant to be helping to ensure that actually we can aid people sort of from getting in trouble, and really supporting and helping families and children in particular thrive in this country and wider.
And so the research sort of methodologies that you're working with, presumably they're sort of social scientific in nature. What kind of approaches do you take then with that work? Is it starting off with looking at kind of policy or practice, or understanding what's actually happening in the sector?
Well, it's mainly over the years, I've specialized in evaluations. So really, where you have policy and practice at the heart of the research, and trying to improve that policy and practice by getting in there and seeing what works, what doesn't work, and how and why. That absolutely includes the voices of those involved. So speaking with children, speaking with parents, with practitioners, and so on. So we use a lot of qualitative methodology, but practitioners and policymakers often they like to know the numbers. They like the big figures at the end of the day. So you have to have that quantitative element in there. So there's surveys, there's evaluations of impact, and it's not talking about research impact, it's talking about impact of whatever intervention or custodial solution is in place. But you see, what happened about 20 years ago and this is how I got into my very specialist area, which I'll come on to, is we were doing the evaluation of the Medway Secure Training Centre about, say the early 2000s. And we were looking at all the things that happened in custody and to try and work out what was it that made the difference to whether a child came out and offended or not.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll tell you what, that was my first major professional research project, and nothing was making a difference. We were looking at all these variables statistically, what would make a difference, what wouldn't, and we found nothing. And then we decided to not look specifically at what happened inside, but what happened when they got out. And we found that's what made the difference. It was what happened when they got out and the transition between the two. And so that led us to look at what's become known as resettlement. So the transition out of custody into the community. And we realized that was what made the difference. It's how much that transition was supported. And so we worked very closely with policymakers at the time in the Home Office as it was, and then the Youth Justice Board and Ministry of Justice, to say, right, this is what you've got to focus on. We've got to get some policies. We've got to find out what works in resettlement, what doesn't work in resettlement. And so much of my sort of career in the 2000s was about really making that known and discovering more about what worked, and working very closely with policymakers and practitioners to then put that into guidance and put that into practice.
And I imagine that given that this wasn't well known or known at all, that there were incredibly different approaches across the country about how this is done. And did you find that there were vast differences in how they approached the process?
Well, I think, first of all, it's just a lack of awareness. I mean, even if policymakers are shouting about this, for it to filter down into everyday practice, when there are so many pressures on practitioners, particularly those in custody and those working with kids who are in trouble, to actually raise that awareness to say, look, you've got to focus on this. That's the first thing. And then in terms of approaches, well, there's a big variety of approaches. What we did in the mid to late 2000s, the noughties, was to work with practitioners and policymakers on testing out different models, I think that they were called consortia at the time, resettlement consortia around the country, to try out different ways of supporting kids coming out of custody. And by about 10 years ago, by about 2012, we'd established a whole catalogue of factors that if practitioners put this into practice, then you'll get better outcomes. So all different things like the amount of time before release they need to work on accommodation for the kids coming out, the amount of time they need to work on education, because that's what was happening. We were finding that kids were coming out of custody and they didn't have anywhere to stay. To some degree, if they were kids in care, they wouldn't even know which city they were going to be placed in. Wow. And it often took far too long for them to come out and be in education when they came out of custody. And the thing is with kids is, if practitioners say to them, oh yeah, you'll get accommodation, or oh yeah, you'll get some education, it doesn't come to pass, they very quickly get disillusioned. Mm-hmm. And end up thinking, okay, the system's letting me down. I don't trust the adults anymore. They end up gravitating back to their peers who may have brought them into offending or to gangs and so on. And so you really need to have that support set up. And what we found is that those consortia areas, those particular projects that we worked with and helped set up, they made a difference. They really did make a difference out there, and you could cut reoffending within the sort of the license period after they come out of custody, the first few months. You could cut that by half. Really, really worked well. And then I remember around about the mid 2010, so about 2014, 2015, we helped the Inspectorate of Probation create the criteria by which to test how well youth offending teams, those helping in the community, how well they were doing resettlement. And having worked for 15 years or so on creating all these different, links, statistical links for what made a difference to what, the inspectorate, based on our criteria, found that it was just not being done. These
Wow.
individual projects we'd worked with around the country, they were doing it great, but it just didn't seem to get into everyday practice, which was really disappointing when you spend so long and you know it's out there, you know the policy's out there, you know the guidance is out there, but it's not being filtered through to practice as business as usual across the country. So at that point, about 7-8 years ago, in the about 2014 2015, I remember that was a particularly low point, thinking we've done all this work, we've identified it, but it's not really making that much of a difference to kids' lives. What do we do at that point?
And did you have an understanding as to why that wasn't being adopted? What was happening there?
Well, that was the mystery, Andy.
Yeah.
That was the real question mark for us. Why wasn't it being adopted out there by practitioners? And we were fortunate enough to get some funding for a big research project called Beyond Youth Custody. And it was the University of Salford together with NACRO, which is a crime reduction charity, and the University of Bedfordshire and an organisation called ARCS UK. And we worked together to then really answer that question, which is, if all of this is out there and we know the statistical links and the factors you've got to be put in place, why is it that practitioners aren't putting that in place? Why is it not working? Why is it not making a difference to kids? It's very frustrating as a social scientist when you come up with all of this and you find it's not happening. And
yeah,
and what we found very quickly in that Beyond Youth Custody project, was funded by the National Lottery, big lottery fund, is that well, it wasn't for want of trying from practitioners. They thought that they were doing resettlement. They thought that they were doing what was meant to be done, because they were they were working on some accommodation for kids. They were working on some education for kids. But the problem was that we found is that it was all kind of out of context. It was like, oh, we'll get some accommodation, we'll get some education. And it wasn't necessarily the right accommodation for that child, or the right education, or the right health support, or the right training, or any of these things. And we were like, well, why is that not the case? What's going on there? And what became very obvious very quickly to us, once we really looked into this as an issue, was a lack of understanding about how doing these things would make a difference. So lots of evaluations look at what works, and they say, if you do this, that will work. And if you think of preventing offending or stopping offending as a long-term symptom of something, and you do this, how does one get to the other? How does helping them in this particular training, how does that get to preventing offending? So in other words, it was a theory of change that was missing in resettlement. And we were like, right, that's it. There's this lack of understanding. There's this, everything was done out of context. So nobody knew how their bit made a difference to the overall, or how their bit tied in with what somebody else was doing, or the right type of accommodation to get to that end point for that child. So the project then became about trying to find out what that theory of change was. So we looked back at all the data we had from all those evaluations over the 20 years or so, and did loads more interviews with kids and interviews with practitioners to try and work out when resettlement after custody worked for a child, when they got resettled, when they stopped offending, what was actually going on, not the statistical links with all these factors, but what was actually happening in their lives that made that change for them, or helped them change, or turn their lives around. What was really going on? And what we found was that it was a journey that they went on. We'd always thought of resettlement as almost like this transition point from custody to community, but actually it was a long journey that they would go on. And it wasn't a sentence journey. It was a personal journey that they would go on, where there would be a change or a shift in themselves that happened and that needed to be supported. And what that change was a change in identity, a change in the way they saw themselves and their place in the world. And we found that when kids were in custody, usually they'd had a whole series of experiences that, from trauma to labeling to exclusion from school to all sorts of things, which had led them to think of themselves and their place in the world in a way that was conducive to offending. It was almost bound to happen with offending was almost bound to come out of the way they saw themselves. And that when resettlement was successful, there was a shift in the way they saw themselves to beginning to see themselves in a way that was allowing or going to allow or going to support sort of a constructive future. So they started to see themselves as having a positive place in the world, or having a future, or having a particular interests that would help them move forward. These building blocks for shifting their identity was different activities they managed to get involved in, and different interactions they had with people that would support this shift in themselves and start to buoy them up, start to say, yeah, actually you are a good listener, aren't you? Or you are good at this, or you are good at that. And so they can start to think about themselves in that way. Or different roles that they took on. So it might be, formal roles like a student, or it might be a role like I'm the one who fixes the IT in the area, or whatever. It's kind of all these different ways to help them think about themselves differently. So then, once we'd identified and recognized that, which actually had been seen previously with adults in something called desistance or secondary desistance, but here we were seeing it in practice and realizing that was the key to resettlement with kids. Once we got that breakthrough, it became about making sure that everybody recognized that if that's what makes the difference, that has got to be the aim of custody and resettlement if you're going to help kids thrive in the future, if you're going to help them sort of turn their lives around if they're in trouble, or really help develop them. It's about supporting that shift or development of pro-social as opposed to antisocial, pro-social identity. So that was the key. And then it became about, right, how can we work with practitioners and policymakers to build a framework that would translate that messages and associated research findings into practice that they could go forward with and build policies around, build different guidance around, and so on. So that then became the next task for us.
I mean, it's absolutely fascinating to hear this. I mean, especially the clarity of where you sort of discovered what needed to be done. And I think that the first sort of thing I think about after hearing that is really, how do you then sort of monitor and make sense of that transition in sort of sense of identity over that process? So did you have to sort of develop ways that were able to understand this process, or how is it sort of documented as to whether someone was on that right path or not going through it sufficiently?
Well, actually, that's a really good question, Andy. And to be honest with you, we're still working on it. We're still working on that measurement, because everybody's identity is individual. So how do you measure a shift in pro-social identity? What we have done, we've had some very crude measures so far. We are still working on this, but we've had some very crude measures, like asking the worker, does the child see themselves as an offender? I mean, something really, really crude. But even as crude as that, we can clearly see that it is linked with outcome. But I'll tell you what's also worrying when you ask that, do they see themselves as an offender? Quite often when kids go into custody, it's never quite as cemented in their identity as when they come out of custody. In other words, the prison process actually makes them feel more like an offender and is more conducive to offending. So it's actually more likely to make them offend by sending them to prison. It's almost like you move them back behind the starting line, so that there's much further to go to get them out of offending. So we're starting from a really difficult position, but we are putting those into practice. But the main job really was to create that framework called the Beyond Youth Custody Framework, to put that into practice, so that there's actually a policy and practice basis to drive that improvement, and to help kids in future. Because it's all very well coming up with those messages, but unless you build it into the system, unless you persuade policymakers and actually have build it into forms, build it into processes, it's never going to happen. It's like people are going to come along to training days and we tell them about these messages and they go, oh yeah, that's great, that would be marvelous. And then they go back to their real life where they're dealing with crisis after crisis. And unless it's there in their procedures, in their policies, they're not going to be able to do it. That it just goes away with the next crisis, the next firefighting. So what we had to do was to work very closely with policymakers to build that into the structure of the next guidance, the next service agreements, the training, the training, the initial professional training, professional development, build our findings and messages into that. And the way we did that was to work with the Ministry of Justice and the Youth Justice Board, of which I'm a member. I applied to become a member of the Youth Justice Board, which is the National England and Wales board that helps to develop policy and monitor the youth justice system and have advised the Secretary of State for Justice. And so he appointed me in 2018, and I've been there with specific responsibility for custody and guiding and advising custody and resettlement. And I was appointed basically because of my involvement in this research and to help them to put that into policy. So what we did was create this a policy framework based on contemporary understanding, all these messages, called constructive resettlement. And constructive resettlement translated those messages into a 3-part framework from Beyond Youth Custody. The first bit of the framework was the realization that you don't just rush to put in structural support like accommodation and training. That has to be the right support. So it means that you need a personal support, a load of personal support where you talk with the child and you understand their identity, what might be leading to offending. You help them look for a future identity. You help look for their strengths. And then you put in, you think about what route to get to their future positive identity you need. And it's once you've identified that route, then you can work out what's the structures, what's the accommodation, what's the training that we need to put in place in order to get the child there. So don't rush to that. That's the first thing. We call that constructive casework. Then the second was a set of 5 principles that we worked out are always associated with support that is successful, that is constructive, that helps develop identity. And that's become known on Twitter as the 5 C's, which essentially is about having consistent support, coordinated support, needs to be customized because every child's identity is different, needs to be co-created with the child because it's their identity, and it needs to be future focused and positive, constructive. So consistent, coordinated, customized, co-created and constructed. I found practitioners love sort of acronyms and 5 C's and 4 C's and so on. And the third of the 3 elements to constructive resettlement is a model of identity awareness, where we need to be constantly aware of what messages the child is giving us about who they are, about their identity. And they do that all the time. People do that all the time, from the language, from what they're doing, from what they're saying. They give over messages about who they are, the way they think about themselves and their place in the world. So we need to be alert to that. I mean, if in meetings on Teams, you can see people are giving messages about who they are, from the way they speak to the mugs that they have, that written on them. Everybody's giving messages. So practitioners need to be aware of that for children. They're often all the time telling us about who they are and the way they see themselves. But also practitioners need to be very aware of the messages that they are giving the child about the way we as professionals see those children. It's the classic labeling theory. If we label them or if we tell them they're bad or whatever, or they're risky, they're a risk to society. If you start telling them that, kids very quickly live up to or down to expectation. So if identity is based on interactions with others, then we need to be very careful about those interactions. So the constructive casework, the 5 C's and the identity awareness, we put that into policy framework, worked with the Youth Justice Board. Then it's about putting that into national standards, putting that into inspection criteria, putting that into training packages for practitioners, writing lots of guidance, which we did with NACRO and Beyond Youth Custody. Once you do that, it gets used and it's out there. And now we've got a good number. I think it's 50 plus youth offending teams around the country who are fully signed up to working with this and others. It's being built into the template for all youth justice teams around the country to say how they're going to tackle resettlement, now being specifically asked about, you know, how they're going to be adopting constructive resettlement. So once you start building it into these processes, working with policymakers and practitioners, that's the way to get out there, to get it out there so that it can be used. And these and at the end of the day, that's about practitioners using what we currently know, contemporary understanding from research that makes a difference to children's lives.
I mean, I have to say, Neil, I feel so proud that we have this research taking place at the university. And, you know, from what I can hear, it just feels like this is a remarkably transformative piece of work that certainly seems like a lifetime commitment, but also just to have that ability to shape how the policy sector is approaching the subject must be, I mean, but we often don't talk about it, it must be rewarding to see that level of impact across the country and to see that now rolled out in those areas that you described. What's the, I mean, it sounds also like the training process for the people involved with this work has had to really be reconfigured around a whole range of new skills and knowledge sets, really.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we got to a point in youth justice. I don't want to go into too much detail, but we got to a point in youth justice probably about 5 years ago, where it was almost like it was a computer says no situation, where you did these risk assessments and if it said you need to send a child on this intervention, you'd do that and so on. And it not only was that pretty limited, but it took away what we now know is so important in working with kids, which is about relationships. It's about relationships with adults. But once you realize that, and researchers really, and this research has certainly underlined that, once you realize you need to do that, well, then there's repercussions for training, for professional development, for all sorts of things. And this now, this theory of change, this understanding that it's about helping develop children's identity, that's now been built into a new guiding principle for youth justice, the youth justice sector, for all workers, all professionals within youth justice, called Child First, which is this is a bigger finding, something that a lot of researchers around the country and now appreciate, that actually, in order to really make a difference to children's lives, things like identity of development, that's the same as for any child. These kids are no different. It's the same as for any child to thrive. And once you help any child thrive and treat them as children first, not offenders first, children first, then actually you're going to end up with better outcomes, less offending, safer communities, fewer victims out there. And this is the theory of change. Now, this developing identity from constructive resettlement, we've now widened that out to called constructive working, because we now recognize that actually this makes sense not just for kids in custody, but actually working in this positive way and this strengths-based way makes sense for all kids within the youth justice system. So we've now got more and more youth offending teams, and even actually now young adults we're working with, not just kids, to say, right, this makes sense as a framework for us working. But yeah, to answer your original point, you're right, it's a different way of thinking about things. It's not just about addressing a risk factor that a computer has said you need to send someone on an intervention. It's about working with them, recognizing that everybody's different, everybody's identity is different, and let's help them to thrive as individuals.
It feels like you've got still a lot of work to do. I mean, it's so far down the process already, but it feels like there's still so much more that you can contribute here. I wonder, just to sort of pick up finally, because often when we sort of develop these case studies, we don't often get to hear much about the process. And one of the things you have to do is to create your sort of evidence to support your impact. How difficult was that? I mean, it sounds actually that it wouldn't be very difficult at all because the impact is so apparent, but tell us a bit about the process for you in evidencing that impact a little bit.
Well, I think, yeah, for me, it's been a career of doing this, of discovering research findings and then, using that as evidence to inform policymakers to put something else in place, and then using the evidence from an evaluation from that to put something else in place. So between the year 1998 and 2012, there was a whole series of research projects and evaluations where I was working with the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice and the Youth Justice Board to build this evidence base, as I say, and then to put it on their sort of resource hubs and let them use that to guide. So it's not sort of where we've just discovered one sort of piece of evidence. It's a whole load. But in the end, you do need to provide that evidence. You need to provide, good statistics and really important quotations from kids and things that policymakers can grab hold of and say, yeah, that makes sense. And it's about understanding the perspective of the policymaker and the practitioner, somebody out there in a youth offending team. What is it that they need to hear as a message that makes sense and makes sense of everything that's happening for them. So, we're not the experts here, and we have to realize as researchers, we're not the experts. In everyday practice, what we're the experts in is research. So we can provide the messages, but then we have to work with practitioners, with policymakers to translate those into their everyday world and to solve the problem, that they face every day. And that's the critical thing. It's making sure that we can help them, because if we just produce these research findings, even a good evidence of what is needed to persuade them, unless it makes sense to them, unless you work actively with policymakers and practitioners, it's not going to happen. So a big part of my method, if you like, is actually working very closely and being proactive and going out there. As I say, I was seconded to as Deputy Chief Inspector of Probation. I was seconded to different inspections, member of the Youth Justice Board, been in various committees. You need to get out there and get in there to really make that difference, to make people aware. And I think that's been a shift in academia. That didn't happen years and years ago. You used to produce an article and almost like hope that it got disseminated. I think we recognize now that to make a real impact, you have to go out there and work very closely from the perspective of practitioners to play our expert academic role and to really make that difference. So yeah, you're right. I've been doing that, but also, I'm not going to stop doing that. That's, as I say, that's why I do this, to help make a difference and to help inform policy and practice. And these findings and the next set of findings that we have when coming out of the research projects that we're now involved in, that's going to go forward and hopefully, build on what we've learned over the past 20 years or so in this research.
And that was going to be my final question. What is the next bit? What's the next big sort of hurdle for you? Is it just keep going, or what's the next bit for you?
Well, I'm continuing in my role on the Youth Justice Board, so very much focused still within improving justice. I've been working quite closely with the Youth Custody Service on trying to embed this within these findings within their practice. So there's still a way to go to fully embed this particular work. So I'm not going to give up on that. But also now what I've started doing is working with adult probation more, because that beyond youth custody research that I talked about was not just with kids. It was actually with services up to 25. So now trying to get this into adult and young adult probation. So we have projects involved with Northwest and National Probation Services. So that's our next focus, to really kind of to help do the same thing as we've done with youth justice into young adults. So a lot of work there, and we've been funded by Barrow Cadbury Trust to work on that, as well as my sort of more general work looking at and kids' experiences with crime. We've just been funded by the Nuffield Foundation to run the largest ever survey of children's experiences of crime in Britain, and working with Professor Christopher Birkbeck, also at Salford within the sociology and criminology team, to run that survey, and that's part of an international survey where in 30 plus countries around the world they're also having their national surveys. That's going to be absolutely fascinating. And again, the trick there is to find what are the lessons in kids' experiences of crime that we can feed in to policymakers and practitioners to ensure that that we get better prevention, so that kids are never drawn into the youth justice system in the first place. That's the next step for me.
Well, it's been fantastic speaking to you, Neal. I'm really amazed by how much you've achieved in this case study, and just wonderful to hear how much of a difference it's making. So many congratulations on the work, and I really look forward to seeing how it develops in the future. And finally, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks very much, Andy. It's been an absolute pleasure.
You take care. Bye-bye.